All right, this is The Earth and Its Peoples by Richard Bulliet, Chapter 32, Section 3, The Challenge of Population Growth. So looking at world history more recently, 1975 to the year 2000 is what this chapter essentially covers. One important global trend to take note of is the growth of population really around the world. And between the years 1950 and years 1950 and the year 2000, global population has doubled, right, in just those 50 years. And this has had, enormous consequences. Concerns about population date back to the Industrial Revolution, especially in Europe. We're talking about roughly, the 1700s to, 1800s, in that. Actually, no, that's not entirely correct. Industrial Revolution, we're mostly talking about like 1750 to about the year 1900, around there. And because of industrial technology, population, especially in urban areas, soared. And in a lot of ways, Europe became the world's leader in terms of being the most populous area of the globe. Thomas Malthus is probably the most well-known and popular person expressing his concerns about population growth. And pretty much what he said back in the 1800s was that or maybe even the 1700s, population growth would outstrip the food supply. In other words, Malthus was concerned that so many people were being born that the globe could not provide enough food, and everybody would essentially starve to death. This turned out not to be the case because of things like technology. But it was one of the earliest kind of ideas regarding concerns about population growth. I mean, really up until that point, and for a long time afterwards, nations believed that the higher population, the better, and that was pretty much the case for all of human history. Some countries not until the 1970s and 1980s beginning to put forward policies that help reduce population because some of the stress that it puts on resources and the environment. For example, China's one-child policy is a perfect example of a nation trying to do something to limit population growth. Technology, better food was also contributing to this, and people living longer, right? Better health. Now, in those European nations that first underwent the Industrial Revolution, a sort of transformation of population or demographics occurred, and that was demographic transition. So if you're not familiar, demographic is just a word for population. And that was with, things like better medicine, people began living longer, right? Reduced mortality. Mortality means dying. So less people were dying. People were living much longer. But in countries that went through the Industrial Revolution, it also turned out that families were having much fewer children. So this led to, in general, a much older population. And this was the case, or this is the case in countries like, Western Europe, Japan, the United States, right? A lot of these countries going through significant population growth, especially, in, the 1800s, the early 1900s, a lot of these areas having significant population growth in that time period, but it's since slowed down. And that's mostly due to the low fertility rate and, less and less people having children. At the same time, though, as we've progressed into the more modern time period, it's also true that our world has become more interconnected than ever. This is especially true for things like air travel, which has made it easier to, travel around the world and cheaper to travel around the world than it's ever been before. The falling of the Soviet Union had also allowed for certain parts of the country to be accessible again, whereas, the Cold War kind of divided people within their camps. The eastern part of Europe was blocked off from the western part of Europe. And because of this, it's made the globe more susceptible to disease. So interconnectedness, we might say, makes world more susceptible to, we'll just say, epidemic. And a good example of this is HIV/AIDS, which has become a global health crisis. It's claimed the lives of 25 million people since coming around in the 1970s and 1980s. Not to mention any other sort of flu or disease, whether it's bird flu, SARS, COVID-19. This is part of the one of the repercussions of living with an interconnected globe. For those industrialized nations, so again, industrialized nations, we're talking about Western Europe, Japan, United States. Again, falling fertility, rising life expectancy. One consequence that this has had is that it's put into question certain social policies. So, for example, things like medical services, retirement plans. Again, these are something that really aid old people. And in many of these countries, the question is, is there enough young workers to support these, this welfare? Now, are there enough workers paying into a state-sponsored welfare program in order for those people to get retirement? Again, medical services disproportionately go to old people. For the most part, industrialized nations have been able to account for this, mainly due to immigration. Much younger people from other countries moving to Western Europe, moving to Japan, or not really Japan, moving to the United States. Japan has a pretty strict immigration policy. But it's certainly one of those things that is true of demographic and population trends. And so what that means is that where all the population growth is happening is in the developing nations. And again, we might call these developing nations pre-industrial. They typically tend to be the more poor parts of the world, less technologically advanced, and 95% of future growth is occurring in those particular nations. In terms of population pyramids, old and young, a population pyramid illustrates sort of the way that different nations are set up demographically. So if we look, for example, at a developed versus a developing is not developed yet, it's there. Pretty much the way that population pyramids are broken down, they're sort of drawn into a graph like this. And, at the very bottom, you have 10 years, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. And so it'll tell you, how many people within a country are 10 years or younger, how many people are 20 years or younger, how many people are 30 years or younger, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And for developing nations, it very much looks like this, right? Kind of like a cone or a pyramid. And what that means is that they have very large, young population, and that's because there's high fertility. And generally speaking, high mortality. That in developing nations, the sort of medical care and the technology and the standard of living isn't allowing people to live very long. Now, this is, obviously past 40, 50 years. But, this is the way they're shaped. Whereas in developed nations, it pretty much just looks like this, right? There are roughly about the same number of people that are, that are every age, just about. And this is low fertility, so not a lot of people having kids, and low mortality. And again, to get back to this point about, retirement and medical services, in a country like this, there's a lot of young people working to pay for the well-being of the retired, where here, there aren't really a lot of young people to help support the people up there. This is a good illustration of the population of the world. I want to say this is the growth rate, population growth rate projected between 2000 and 2050. Green is where there is, actually blue is where there is population loss. Green is where the population is more or less sustaining itself, and it's in the red and orange that population growth is happening. So you can see, at least here, it's Africa, especially a lot of these kind of smaller African states, Mali, Uganda is where population is growing the most rapidly, Afghanistan, but certainly places like Nigeria and Pakistan, where the population is growing pretty significantly.